Good morning, everyone. Today I want to tell you about my research into the birth of research government. This inquiry is inspired by Michel Foucault and his archaeological methods, a way of writing a history of the present. It involves brushing away the sedimentary layers of time, exposing the discursive traces of how things in the past came to be, to help us understand problems of today. This year I've looked at the discursive traces of research government. I've become sensitised particularly to discourses of danger surrounding research and researchers, so I've looked for what these have produced in a particular historical moment, Germany at the end of the 19th century. This is the problem of the present that led me to doctoral study. In my professional life, I'm positioned in a dangerous place. As an ethics committee member, my mission is to support research success and protect human subjects from harm. So what's the problem? Well, in recent years, finding the right balance between these things has become difficult. On one side, there's known as the ethics rupture movement, researchers who vigorously resist the ethics review system, calling it out as a petty, immoral and repressive barrier to research that's killing people. On the other side are the equally vigorous voices of the patient and participant advocates, angry at ethics committees for being too careless, as being the pawns of commercial and institutional interests and letting through unethical research that's killing people. This strikes me as a problem worthy of sustained inquiry. The traditional narrative of the origins of ethics committee begins inside Nazi concentration camps, where physicians conducted inhumane experiments. After these doctors were found guilty of war crimes at Nuremberg, the judgment that they breached basic principles of beneficence, justice and respect has underpinned subsequent ethical statements. The first task of a Foucauldian scholar is to refuse obvious and linear explanations, especially those of origins. Foucault wants us to be really curious about what we've missed by explaining things in any particular way, and then use innovative thinking to come up with different possibilities. By refusing the idea that Nazis made research dangerous and that this resulted in the universal need for regulation and ethics committee review, the horizons of inquiry open. So when did research become dangerous? Since Herophilus performed public dissections on prisoners about to be executed 23 centuries ago? Or when Holy Roman emperors wonder about language acquisition and experiment by depriving babies of verbal interaction and touch? Or when drilling a hole in the head is tried as a cure for madness? Taking part in research has always been accompanied by the spectre of ultimate sacrifice. Is this danger balanced by the greater good of arriving at a deeper understanding of life? In the past, if research was dangerous to but a few individuals, then this paled in comparison with the threat of nasty and brutish diseases which could cut life short. Diseases like smallpox. In 1796, when Edward Jenner scratched pus from a milkmaid's cowpox blister, there she is, into the son of his gardener, he found a vaccination for a devastating illness. If Jenner had made an application to an ethics committee today, this experiment would most certainly have been declined. But Foucault reminds us not to judge the past in terms of the present, but to use the past to explain the present. While there was almost no research government in Jenner's day, 100 years later, in the newly unified German Empire, a similar experiment to this sparked off a short chain of events which I'm describing as the birth of research government. In the final decade of the 19th century, Professor Albert Neisser was working on a vaccination for syphilis. Without their consent, he injected blood serum from patients with syphilis into young prostitutes in hospital with other ailments. The experiment didn't work. The prostitutes contracted the horrible disease. Local reporters got hold of the story, and the ensuing public outrage prompted a legal inquiry into Neisser's research. A surprised NICER was found guilty of assault and battery and paid a small fine. So why have I seized on the NICER case? It's not the first time doctors have been found guilty in criminal courts for common crimes, embezzling, bigamy, or even, as the case of Dr. Holmes shows, the serial murder of hundreds. There's nothing new in this idea of judging dangerousness. In The Birth of the Prison, Foucault explains how society judges its wrongdoers, diagnosing them as insane or criminal, excluding and punishing them as dangerous individuals. There's no reason to think that doctors who committed crimes should be exempt from these mechanisms. But what we're seeing in the NICER's case is a new kind of crime. Elements of common research practice being transcribed onto the criminal code and open to judgment. Something happened after NICER's trial that's even more significant in the story of the birth of research government, a rupture in history. This directive, issued by the Prussian Minister of Health to all hospitals and clinics, prohibited research on those who could not consent and demanded that consent be fully informed. It devolved responsibility for the research to the institution and insisted that researchers keep detailed records. This is an amazing statement. 116 years later, our ethical guidelines haven't shifted very far from this point. We distinguish therapeutic from non-therapeutic research. Informed consent is still a sacred cow. Children still can't consent. But my question is not about consent. This had been established as the standard for practice for some time. My question is about the state stepping into research government, assigning responsibility for the research to the institution, and judging researchers not by criminal codes, but by ethical ones. Foucault wants us to seize on the events that represent change, the ruptures, and really shake them apart to ask, why this? Why now? I want to spend the time left answering these questions. NICER's experiment wasn't very different from the kinds of experiments conducted for centuries. So why had medical research all of a sudden become something political over which the state wanted to intervene? And what did dangerousness have to do with it? Medicine, of course, had been political for a while. Since medieval times, doctors wanted to distinguish themselves from the dangerous hocus-pocus of quackery. And since the scientific revolution, or Copernicus's claim in the 16th century that the Earth moves, research methods were crucial in establishing a new politics of truth, wherein nothing could be believed other than the evidence of one's own eyes. Research distinguished proper doctors from the purveyors of flim-flam. Their prestigious bubble was to burst. The medical profession became something that was increasingly politicised after the social, cultural, political and economic rupture of the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century. This is when the sovereign elites, including doctors, were overthrown. In Foucault's Birth of the Clinic, he describes how, in place of the old monarchic system, a new disciplinary state emerged where doctors were given the task of surveilling, normalising and examining individuals and population. Like police and priests, doctors became the state's instruments. Their particular responsibility is now public hygiene, population health, if you like. In achieving better health, a new danger is bad government. To fight this war, doctors' professional associations formed throughout the 19th century. In this new state, disease is still dangerous, especially epidemics which diminish workforce productivity. As hygiene police, Foucault concluded that doctors relied on research to promote their prestige amongst their peers and continue to diminish the influence of quacks and their magical nostrums. The old tension between proper doctors and charlatans wasn't over, and it still isn't. Think about the battle natural healers have today for legitimacy. Quack remedies were at the commercial peak at the end of the 19th century. Primarily made of alcohol, it's no wonder that people felt better, believing that anything from being female to exhaustion, cholera and cancer could be cured by the corner store's snake oils. While tipsy wives might have been tolerable, perhaps no factory boss wanted drunk staff. Thanks to the agitation of the temperance movement, the US enacted the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, making it compulsory to disclose all ingredients and curbing fraudulent claims. I mention this for two reasons. The first is we have a parallel example of state intervention into health propelled by public controversy. The second reason leads us directly back to Germany, who was leading the world in pharmaceuticals. Bayer, a German company, had the worldwide patent on aspirin. Who knew that real aspirin could prevent pregnancy? Is that not tonight, dear? I've got a headache. But medical commerce was no laughing matter back in Germany. Robert Koch, who taught the aforementioned NICE laboratory skills, thought he had a cure for TB in 1890. Thousands of consumptives descended on Berlin for his tuberculin. Even though Koch's cure turned out to be a fizzer, the German state cannot have missed the economic potential of medical science. Had NICE actually discovered a vaccination for syphilis, we might speculate that he, like Koch, would have been awarded the Nobel Prize and had buildings named in his honour, rather than being taken to trial. Remember what NICE was trying to accomplish. He was trying to defeat an epidemic of syphilis. Combating the awful disease in the coming decades was going to be huge in the story of ethics committees, particularly at Tuskegee. But at this time, the public were desperately hoping that science could triumph. I suspect that the Prussian directive was less to do with the fact that young women were harmed than with NICE's embarrassing failure and the damage done to the precious myth that medicine could end disease. As I researched him, I began to have sympathy for NICE. Clearly uber smart, he was only 24 when he isolated the gonorrhea bacteria. He had a social conscience too, actively trying to decriminalise prostitution. His methods didn't really stand out from the other kind of immunological experiments that had occurred since Jenner, but he was a researcher of his day. In attempting to beat disease, he stopped seeing the whole person in front of him, blinded not by a sexually transmitted disease such as gonorrhea, but by the hunt for microbes. Foucault called this potential for dehumanisation by doctors the medical gaze. With the gaze, doctors obtained knowledge about healthy and diseased bodies who could labour for the market. Bodies, not persons. The gaze is an exercise of power over bodies. Is it possible that ethics committees exist to resist this power, to force researchers to see whole people and not just cells? Was the Prussian directive a way to resist the power of doctors too? A way for the state to remind them in whose service they were working? Foucault's take on raison d'etre, the reason of state, the power that makes populations live, is exemplified by Germany, the world's first welfare state. Bismarck's social insurance policies protected the newly democratised from illness and accidents, helping them recuperate and get back to work. These kinds of policies that counter danger produce individuals aware of themselves as rights-bearing autonomous agents, legitimate contributors to society. They produce correlative obligations in the state to defend its people. I think this transformation has a huge bearing on who research subjects were to become, persons who had a right to say no to research, even in hospital. In NICE's world, as ours, prostitutes go to hospital for care, not to be treated as guinea pigs. The hint that hospitals are places where bad things happen threatens the peaceable operations of the state, a power that has to defend its population in order to counter resistance and win elections. Ultimately, I believe the state had to be seen to act against the likes of NICE in order to protect itself. In my analysis, research government was born inside a heterogeneous mix of discourses that NICE unwittingly found himself tossed about by. He was produced by these as a dangerous individual. And perhaps there was one more dangerous discourse at work. Germany had just emerged from a financial collapse blamed on Jews. Neisser was Jewish, as were a great many German doctors. In the kind of disciplinary state Foucault describes, ensuring racial purity becomes a sad inevitability. Researchers were soon going to play an important role in proving the superiority of certain races. I want to leave you with the thought that the punishment of Neisser in the Prussian directive, seemingly based on sound ethical principles, was perhaps less to do with protecting people from research harms than with a mix of power, money, reputation, racism and politics. In keeping with Foucault's archaeological method, amongst these fragments of the ancestral traces of research ethics, I found some explanation for the tension surrounding committees today. For once we recognise other forces at play, forces that go far beyond the philosophical tradition of explaining what good lives and actions are, we can see how finely balanced research government is. For while what happened inside the concentration camps may not be the origin of research government, we have to remember what can happen even when legislation is in place, when the mix of forces surrounding researchers gets dangerously skewed. It is to the genealogy of the relationship between research risk and its management by techniques of ethics committee power to which my inquiry will now turn, and I look forward to telling you about that soon.